spiritual kind of liberation from the world. And he was part of this movement. After 6 years, he finally discovered what he was looking for. He discovered a cure for suffering from a Buddhist perspective. He had an experience after a 2-day meditation session in North India, in a town today known as Bodh Gaya, where he said to have achieved enlightenment. And so what does enlightenment mean? Enlightenment from a Buddhist perspective, well, he transcended suffering and the causes of suffering, but he did that by cultivating a couple things in his mind stream. He cultivated what he described as perfect wisdom and perfect compassion. Perfect wisdom meaning perfect insight into the nature of reality, into the way that the world works and functions, into the way that he himself functioned, and how those interrelate with one another. And then he also developed this just overwhelming compassion for the suffering and the welfare of all living beings. And this combination of perfect wisdom and perfect compassion is said to have uprooted all of the selfishness and self-centeredness in his mind stream, all of the disturbing emotions, the greed, hatred, anger, jealousy, and attachment, things like this that afflict all of us. And he's said to have purified his mind and achieved what Buddhists describe as the most profound state of peace, the most profound peace of mind that's possible. And that's when he became the Buddha. Buddha is actually a title meaning the one who woke up, the awakened one. So, having discovered what he was looking for, a cure for suffering, he spent the next 45 years of his life teaching what he had learned, the path to achieving this profoundly peaceful, happy, blissful, it's even described as a blissful state of mind of Buddhahood, the perfect kind of repose of a fully enlightened being from a Buddhist perspective. So, what the Buddha said, though, was that he didn't describe himself as a god or anything like that. He said he was a human being who had achieved an extraordinary state. And that everybody had the potential to achieve the same state that he had, which is why he spent the next 45 years of his life teaching those who were interested, those who requested teachings to him, how he did it. The Buddha only taught when he was specifically requested to teach by somebody. Buddhism is not an evangelical religion. The Buddha was not interested in converting people who weren't coming to him looking for something. And part of it, there's a famous line in the 8,000 stanza Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, one of the famous teachings of the Buddha, where he says, probably the simplified centerpiece of the Buddha's teachings is what's known as the Four Noble Truths. I'm sure many of you have heard of that before. And he says in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, he says, there's 4 quadrillion ways of expressing, or names, for the Four Noble Truths, for as many aptitudes as there are living beings. So, in other words, the Buddha didn't describe that he had some exclusive hold on the truth or the path to peace of mind or enlightenment. And so there was no real need to attempt to try to convert other people. Based on people's own mental predispositions, or to use a Buddhist term, karma, oftentimes when the Dalai Lama, maybe this is a good way of putting it, when the Dalai Lama comes to the West and he teaches in the West, he often begins his talks by saying, I'm not interested in converting anybody. If you're Christian, be a good Christian. If you're Muslim, be a good Muslim. If you're Buddhist, be a good Buddhist. Anyway, but the Buddha always encouraged critical inquiry, including of his own teachings. He encouraged his disciples to examine everything he said very closely. If it didn't ring true to them, if it didn't make sense, if it wasn't fruitful in their lives, to give it up. Don't stick to something that's not working. But from a Buddhist perspective, generally speaking, the cause of our suffering, the crux of the problem is our human suffering. And the cause of it, generally speaking, of our stress, anxiety, fear, worries, all of this kinds of stuff, is our fundamental misunderstanding, our ignorance about the world and the way in which things exist. Oftentimes, if you read textbook kind of explanations of Buddhism, it'll say, oh, the cause of suffering is desire, attachment. And certainly the Buddha would agree, desire and attachment are causes of suffering. But what's behind the desire and the attachment is this confusion about the world, this mistake about how we exist and how things in the world exist, which cause us to cling to the idea of some kind of independent, absolute sort of self, from that kind of basic misunderstanding, from which develops very self-centered, self-cherishing kinds of attitudes, and then from that springs the whole host of destructive emotions like anger and hatred, jealousy and whatnot. We see all these things on a small scale in our personal lives, and on a large scale when nations are fighting nations. I think one of you mentioned Navayana, and I imagine you were thinking of Ambedkar, perhaps, who was an early 20th century, he died in 1956, untouchable, ex-untouchable in India, who converted to Buddhism as a way of getting out from under caste oppression. And one of his insights, I think, was that he kind of expanded this notion of this kind of individual ignorance causing our own suffering. He said also when a society functions out of ignorance, it also causes suffering for people in society. And his case in point was the caste system and the kind of institutionalized poverty and degradation that people at the lower rungs of that hierarchy experience in India. I think also when we think of ignorance, it's in some senses sounds funny to say ignorance is the cause of suffering. I think the Dalai Lama put it well once. I heard him say, he said, everybody really wants to be happy. Everybody, who doesn't really want to be happy and kind of have peace of mind? Fundamentally everybody has that, and presumably they would do, if they knew the way to be happy, they would do it. They would do what they needed to do. But he said if you look around, he said you see very few people that are actually really happy on a real gut level, that have real peace of mind, that are really kind of just comfortable in their own skin, so to speak. And he said it's indicative that they really don't know how to be happy. They want to be happy, they would do what they could if they knew the way, but they don't, but they are ignorant of the way. So this is, in one sense, of the kind of idea that ignorance is a cause of suffering. What I wanted to talk about is, well, how does Buddhism explain how to get free from suffering then? So generally speaking, I think we can traditionally Buddhists break up the Buddhist path into three general categories. Teachings on ethics, or the dimensions of the path that are based in ethics, ethical teachings. Those based in meditation practices, contemplative practices, and those based in wisdom. And so, from an ethical perspective, the Buddha gave a variety of different kinds of teachings on ethics. He gave a variety. There were different sets of vows that people could take. There were no commandments in Buddhism, but people could take sets of vows to kind of up the ante of their ethical living, so to speak. So the first set were for life, were precepts for lay people. So, to avoid killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and intoxicants. And then there were vows for monks and nuns, which there were over 250 vows for monks and nuns, and those included celibacy and a quite austere lifestyle. We might talk more about that when I might have some remarks about what he said about the Buddha and women later. But anyway, but then there are also other sets of vows that are associated with different kinds of meditation practices and higher trainings in Buddhism. So some sets of vows are really kind of a kind of ethics of restraint, restraining from engaging in unethical or harmful activities that harm other living beings, like killing and stealing and whatnot. But then there are other sorts of ethical teachings and vows, commitments that Buddhists make that are more about cultivating virtues like generosity or patience or compassion. For instance, one of the vows in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, one of the major Buddhist traditions, is to not abandon compassion for a single sentient being, ever. So any kind of slight moment of anger or hatred towards somebody is a violation of this vow. It holds a pretty high standard then for what it ultimately means to be an ethical person. Anyway, in terms of meditation practices, there are literally probably hundreds of different kinds of meditation practices in the Buddhist tradition, and the various different kinds of meditations are all geared towards cultivating these qualities of Buddhahood, these qualities of what Buddhism would describe as human perfection. So perfect compassion, perfect patience, perfect wisdom, perfect generosity, that sort of thing. And I think it's illustrative. The Tibetan word for meditation, Gompa Gyat, literally translates as to become accustomed to, or to become familiar with something. And generally speaking, the Buddha described human beings as being creatures of habit. And we've mostly habituated ourselves into doing and into actions and thoughts of body, speech, and mind that end up causing us a whole lot of suffering because we're acting on the basis of ignorance, on the basis of self-centered, selfish, self-cherishing kinds of motivations. And what the Buddhist meditation techniques are all geared towards doing is towards rehabituating our mind towards more virtuous ways of thinking and acting and being in the world. So, for example, let's say I'm someone who gets road rage or something like that, and I get cut off on the road, and my habit of mind is to, speed up around the person that just cut me off and maybe give them a mudra, a hand gesture, and maybe yell some things in my car that I wish that they could hear, but they don't. All these things don't really lead to my happiness, and they probably don't lead to the happiness of the person that I cut off or other people around me on the road. But the more that I do that, the more that I'm habituated to continue to do that. So you might notice people that get stressed out on the road tend to get stressed out on the road again and again and again. We've become habituated, or if it's me, if I've become habituated to, responding to some kind of adversity on the road with rage and anger and this and that. What meditation is attempting to do is start to rehabituate our mind. Retrain the mind to not respond to that kind of adversity, that kind of stimulus with anger and rage and the associated behaviors, but to respond with, perhaps with patience or understanding or compassion. So all the different kinds of Buddhist meditation techniques are really geared towards rehabituating the mind, towards purifying the mind, towards training the mind to be more Buddha-like, to be more serene, peaceful, happy, content. Okay. And then the final teachings that the Buddha taught were the teachings on higher wisdom. And these get quite complex, and this probably isn't the best venue for trying to go into Buddhist metaphysics and ontology. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is the tradition that I practice in, they have a curriculum known as a Geshe degree, where the scholars, it's something like a double PhD in Buddhist philosophy, where they spend 20 years studying the major texts of the tradition and debating them in the courtyards each day and whatnot. But generally speaking, the Buddha described the world as being in a constant state of flux, as being interdependent, that everything that exists in the world depends upon causes and conditions for its existence, that everything is changing from moment to moment. There's really not, despite our best efforts, there's really nothing that we can hold on to for any enduring period of time. And the more we come to kind of really understand the way in which the world works, we can respond and live in much more sane and healthy ways that don't go counter to the way in which things actually are from a Buddhist perspective, but rather to live in accord with the world, and as a byproduct of that, be able to kind of find some kind of peace and harmony. So that's kind of my sort of Buddhism in a nutshell in 20 minutes. I thought I might also just make a couple comments on some similarities I find and things that I kind of respect quite a bit about Christianity. My parents recently renewed their wedding vows after 50 years. They were married 50 years this past September. And so they did a formal ceremony. They're Catholic, and had a formal ceremony. And so I went to a Catholic Mass for the first time since I went to Catholic high school 20-some years ago. Maybe 30, I don't know. 28. Anyway, but the message that the priest who officiated the Mass talked about was a message of, I mean, it resonated perfectly with the Buddhist teachings of generosity and kindness and compassion and the loving support that that a husband and wife can share with one another, that communities can share with one another on large and small scales. And the kind of world that he was sort of, there are important differences. There's not a savior in Buddhism. And people don't have to go through a particular avenue or have faith in one particular individual in order to be saved. But there's the idea of a bodhisattva in Buddhism. A bodhisattva is somebody who's achieved enlightenment. So in other words, they've purified their mind stream. They're not